Well, good morning to you. If you have your New Testaments with you this morning, be opening up to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Primero de Corintios capítulo 16, versos 1 a 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. That's where we'll find a beginning place as we study together this morning. We have visitors with us. We're thankful that you're here. If you're able to stick around a little while after services so that we can meet you and get to know you a little bit better, we would really appreciate that. Thank you again so much for being here. We'll meet again this evening at 5 o'clock. If you're in the area, again, we would love to have you come and to worship with us then. I don't know of two topics that preachers hesitate preaching on more than modesty and giving. And we get the giving sermon this morning. I always feel like I have to make the disclaimer, I'm not trying to get a raise. I'm not looking for any additional funding. If you want to give it, that's great, but no. The elders had asked me to put together some thoughts on this. It had been quite a while since we've studied this together. Most often, one of the passages that we turn to immediately when we're talking about this issue is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and let's read those together. Concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of the week, let every one of you put aside and save, as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. Paul had given those instructions to the church at Corinth, and yet as he writes to them several months to a couple of years later, the church at Corinth had not completed what they had initially deigned to do and what they had been called to do. And so, as Paul writes to them for seemingly the second or the third time in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, he reminds them that they had promised long ago to do this good work that they had yet to fulfill and that they needed to complete that they had promised themselves towards. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, in verses 10 and 11, Paul says this, Now he who supplies seed for the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. We want to talk this morning about what we learn from this episode in the life of the Corinthian church. A church that had promised to help out the poor and the needy saints in Jerusalem, but who for an extended period of time here, although they had promised to do so, failed to follow through on that promise. And what instructions the inspired apostle gave them to convince them that they needed to engage in this good work. To set a little bit of a context for ourselves, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 16, the Corinthians were instructed to gather from among themselves for the poor among the saints who were there in Jerusalem. And as we come later, perhaps months later, into 2 Corinthians, they had yet to follow through with what they had promised to do. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 10. Segundo de Corintios capítulo 8, verso 10. Paul says this in verse 10, And I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it. But now finish doing it also, just as there was the readiness to desire it, so there may be also the completion of it by your ability. It wasn't that the church at Corinth was hesitant to do this. They were eager to do this, just for one reason or another. No doubt, like many of us have experienced in our own lives, when we purpose to do something good, for some reason or another, we just fail to follow through with it in a timely manner. And that's what had happened here in Corinth. But while they had failed to follow through in a timely manner, their brethren were suffering. They needed help. And so Paul calls on them to initiate the action that they were so ready to accomplish. He says in chapter 9 and verse 2, capítulo 9, verso 2, For I know your readiness of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely, that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I have sent the brethren that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. They were ready. They just needed to initiate that good work. And what we're going to read about this morning is what Paul said to them to encourage them. Act in this manner. But before we get into that, there comes a common question anytime we talk about this first day of the week contribution, the treasury of the local church, what it is to be used for. Somebody rightly might ask the question, well, wasn't what we're seeing in 1 Corinthians 16, wasn't that a one-time need? I mean, as we're looking at 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, as I have given direction to the churches of Galatia, so you do also concerning the collection for the saints. And then verse 3, when I arrive, whomever you approve, I shall send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And so if what he is writing to the Corinthian church here about is a collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem, wasn't that kind of a one-time thing and thus doesn't really apply to us? Or if there's a lack of needy saints, does 1 Corinthians 16 even really apply to us today? And just a couple of things as we think through that together. Number one is this, that just because I am unaware of needy saints doesn't mean that there are none. This is so often a disconnect that happens in local churches, that there maybe is a need that perhaps the elders know about, perhaps a select few know about, but the congregation at large does not know about. And somebody might fall into the trap of thinking, well, since I'm not aware of any needy saints among us, that must mean that there are none. And of course, I hope we realize that just because I don't know about something doesn't mean that that need is not present. But secondly, it is true that 1 Corinthians 16 is addressing a collection for the needy saints that were there in Jerusalem, much like we see in Romans chapter 15 as well. However, what we see in 1 Corinthians 16 is the only New Testament passage which addresses specifically how a local church funds itself. And we see this referenced, I think, in other passages, perhaps in the book of Acts as well. But there is no New Testament passage that lays it out in such specifics as we see here in 1 Corinthians 16. How was this local church at Corinth to fund itself to do the good work of, for example, helping needy saints? And as we see in 1 Corinthians 16, it was a free will contribution from its members upon the first day of the week. Somebody says, okay, well then all that's authorized in 1 Corinthians 16 is helping needy saints from the church's treasury. And if 1 Corinthians 16 is all that we have, that might be true. But as we look throughout the rest of the New Testament, we see examples of local churches funding other endeavors besides the relief of needy saints. For example, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15, we see the church at Philippi funding and supporting Paul in his work of ministry. In fact, let's read that passage together just so we can see exactly how Paul describes this. Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 15. Filipenses capítulo 4, verso 15. Philippians chapter 4 and in verse 15. I think I'm in rather good company by saying I have a hesitancy sometimes to speak on the collection. I think you sense much the same thing here from Paul in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. He says, and you yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel after I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Here's somebody who's being funded in his work of evangelism. And then read the very next verse. Not that I seek the gift itself. Paul says, I'm not... I want you to be sure you understand. It's not about me lining my pockets. I don't seek the gift itself, but I seek for the profit which increases to your account. That one way that you and I in a local church have fellowship in sharing the gospel is by our funds going to evangelists who take the gospel wherever they go. That is not the only way we are to engage in evangelism, but it is a legitimate way in which we engage in evangelism. And we see that with the church at Philippi and with Paul. We see much the same thing with Barnabas and his work of encouragement, as you see there in Acts chapter 11 and verse 22. So while 1 Corinthians 16 might be envisioning a specific scenario where there was a specific need in Jerusalem, the passage is much more broad as it relates to how a local church funds itself. And that is by the free will offering of its members on the first day of the week. That's what Corinth had been directed to do. That's what they were eager to do. But for some reason or another, they had failed to act up to this point. And so as Paul writes back about a year later in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 9, he calls on them to finish this good work that they had originally planned to start. And he talks to them about how they were to give. And as he speaks to them about how they were to give, certainly it speaks to you and to me about how it is that you and I are supposed to give in a local church, to fund a local church, to do the work that God has set forth for that local church to do. So, for example, look over here in chapter 8 and verse 12. Segundo de Corintios, capítulo 8, verso 12. He says this, for if the readiness is present, the readiness, the eagerness, this activity to contribute, if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a man has and not according to what he does not have. So when we talk about giving in the context of the local church, it's based upon what I have. It's not that I'm looking out at other members and I'm trying to guess what they're giving. I'm trying to measure up, saying, okay, this person gives $50 a week, this person gives $20 a week, this person gives $5, this person gives $1,000. I've got to get the middle ground somewhere. That's not the point. Giving is such an individual matter as it's described in Scripture. We don't see anything like we see in the Old Testament, a kind of 10% tithing idea. But what we do see is God giving instructions that we are to give based upon what we have. This echoes the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, as he may prosper. That what I am to give is based upon what I have, not based upon what I don't have. I'm not held to some inconceivable standard, but rather the only standard to which I'm held is the standard of what I have. Look at verse 14. Actually, go back to verse 13 and let's pick up here. Verso 13. For this is not for the ease of others and for your affliction, but by way of equality. There's something in our giving that is to promote this idea of equality, and here it is, verse 14. At this present time, your abundance being a supply for their want, that their abundance also may become a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. There's this idea in our giving that we must give with the realization that, as we say, the tables might turn. That you and I give in such a way that we're able to, for example, help needy saints in other places, but with the realization that one day that might be me. And maybe that's not a thought that we engage with very, very much, but it's certainly a very biblical idea. That I give in such a way, realizing that one day the tables might be turned, the situations might be reversed, and rather than being the one who is able to give, I'm now the one who is needing to receive. While I have something to give, am I giving in a way that would honor that idea? Am I giving in a way that reflects the reality that one day the tables might turn? In chapter 8 and verse 20, they were to give with generosity, taking precaution that no one should discredit us in our administration of this generous gift. Described later in chapter 9 and verse 5 as a bountiful gift. And then later in chapter 9 and verse 7, described as a cheerful gift. We need to give with generosity. These Corinthians, who apparently were in a time of financially speaking, relative ease, were encouraged to give generously to their brethren. And without tumultuous, we see that the New Testament economy being an economy not just being financed as just life in general, we can see how very easily things could turn, and there could be a moment where Jerusalem is prospering and where Corinth is in need. They were to give generously just as they would want someone to give generously to them. The Corinthians were to give with forethought and with planning. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 2. Capítulo 9, verso 2. Paul says, I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia, and that's the province in which the city of Corinth was located, that Achaia has been prepared since the last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. The fact that you Corinthians were so eager to give has stirred up other people, Paul says. That's why it's such a travesty, as he speaks to the Corinthian church, why it was such a travesty that they hadn't followed through on their promise yet. But I have sent the brethren that are boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, that as I was saying, you may be prepared, lest if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, should be put to shame by this confidence. How sad it would be, Paul says, if when we're coming to receive this gift and carry it to where it needs to go, that there might be some Macedonians who were so very encouraged by your willingness to help, who find that all it was just words. That you said you would help, you were eager to help, and nobody's doubting the sincerity of that, but you haven't followed through on it. Just how utterly depressing would that be? So verse 5, Paul says, so I thought it necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead of you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift, that the same might be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. They were to give with forethought and planning. They were to think about what they were doing, and they were to give deliberately, to see the need and to respond to the need as they knew that it was there, and to make sure that their giving was not affected by covetousness. Which is a danger we still face today, right? That we view my stuff as my stuff and belonging to me, and no one else is entitled to my stuff. Except we see that all good gifts that we enjoy ultimately come down from God, and nothing is really our stuff. Really, it all belongs to Him, which is what Paul reminds the Corinthians of here. Before then reminding them that they are to give bountifully and they're to give cheerfully. He says, now I say this, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Let each one do just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So I wanted to take these 6 principles for just a moment, and let's try to make these applicable to our lives. And then we'll be done this morning. They were to give, the Corinthians were, based upon what they had, and using these passages, as we do all New Testament passages, as guideposts for our lives today. We're to give based upon what we have. So here's a question. Is my giving, and full disclosure, I don't know what you give. There may be 1 or 2 people in here who know what I give just because they see the digital receipt of what I give. That there's an email that goes out whenever that is done. But is my giving consistent with what I have? That's where this all started in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 12. They were not to give based upon what they didn't have. They were to give based upon what they did have. As Paul described it in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, to give as each one has been prospered. I can remember somebody talking to me about this one time and came up with a question, said, well, you know what, Tyler, I it felt like it was almost some sort of gotcha question. Well, you know, I didn't earn anything this week, so what am I supposed to give? I said, well, 1 Corinthians 16 says, give as you prosper, and if you're telling me you haven't prospered anything this week, then I guess you don't have anything to give. And that answer kind of took this person aback, the person who was quite critical of seemingly just the concept of giving itself. This isn't something designed to exercise control over a populace, which is too often the idea that people circulating around religion seem to have, that this is kind of a top-down edict, not from God, not from Jesus, but kind of from the leaders of local churches who want to exercise control over it. You know, full disclosure, we've got 4 shepherds here at this local church who are leaders of it, and none of them draw a salary from this local church. They don't take a penny. It's not about what some would call fleecing the flock, right? The giving that we're talking about, the giving that we see in the New Testament, is not about exercising control, keeping people under control, keeping your thumb on top of somebody else. Giving in the local church is about recognizing a need, being prepared for needs before they arise, and giving consistently with what I have. Let me tell you how there was one church in Longview, Texas that dealt with this. Not a church of Christ. But in order to become a member at this local church, you had to submit your most recent tax statement to this local church. And the leadership committee would look at that and tell you what your contribution was to be each week. And if you failed to follow through with that, you would be put out from the church. Brethren, we don't see anything like that in Scripture. That violates every principle we see in 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians 9. This is a very private matter, and that's what, for example, makes preaching on it so difficult. I recognize this is a private matter, so please don't walk out of here thinking, well, Tyler said I have to give X, Y, Z. I'm not saying that. Somebody write that down. Not saying that. We're giving consistently with what we have. That's the principle that we see here. I'm giving consistently with what I have been prospered. Is that how I'm giving? They were to give based upon what they had. There's a story of a Christian, not here. I don't think anyone knows this person, who started a business, grew that business. 15, 20 years down the road, this business is firmly established in the community, has a sterling reputation. He and his family are doing quite well. Local church is having some financial issues because of some issues with their building and some preaching efforts they were trying to engage in. They suddenly looked at their bank account balance was way low. And one of the elders who did some of the depositing kind of had a rough idea of what some people were giving. And this family, making a very, very good living, was giving $20 a week. It was a family that was very genuine, very sincere. One of the elders went and talked with the gentleman about it. Said, hey, I'm not trying to pry into business that's not mine, and if you want to stop this conversation, you tell me, but I was just curious. Said, I've been handling the deposits at this church for 20 years now. You give the same $20 today that you gave 15 years ago. It had never changed. I was just curious about that. And the fellow just had never thought about it before. It was just one of those things that he just did every week. He filled out his check for $20 and put it in the plate when it passed by. He hadn't really thought about the fact that he'd been prospered more since that time. I don't know what he had been prospered during that time, but he apparently felt as though he had been prospered to a significant degree that he needed to up what he was giving. He just hadn't thought about it. You think maybe that was the situation at Corinth, that there were some people who had been prospered, who had the ability to give more, they just hadn't thought about it? Our giving needs to be consistent with what we have, with how we've been prospered. We need to give, as we saw in chapter 8 and verse 14, knowing that the tables may turn, knowing that the situation may be reversed. So if we see this reality, if we understand this, does this change how we give? Just like we saw in verse 12, my giving needs to be consistent with what I have, but then it takes on an additional element is, do I give in the manner that I would want another to give if I was the one who was going to be the recipient? We'll talk about this later. One of the downfalls, it seems, in congregations is that congregations just sometimes don't know what's going on with the money. And this is where I applaud our eldership here, who has been trying over the past couple of years to make sure they do a concerted job of getting this financial information out in a more open way to the members of this congregation. I think that's great. And it helps us know about needs that are present, needs that might arise, and it helps us to be prepared. It helps us to give. My giving with the recognition that one day the tables might turn and I might need to be the recipient. How generous would I want people to be? Which is our next point as you look there at chapter 8 and verse 20. They were to give with generosity. So as I look at what I give, and I look at how I've been prospered, whatever I give, does that reflect generosity or does it reflect selfishness? Am I giving from a heart of gratitude and recognition of God's blessing? Am I being selfish? And if you're thinking, well, Tyler, you don't know my situation, you're absolutely right, I don't. And I'm not up here trying to shame anybody. Like I said, I don't know what anybody gives, and I want it to stay that way. But there are some principles we need to think about as we engage in this what admittedly is a private action, and I get that. But our giving needs to be with generosity. And as we come into chapter 9, verses 2 through 5 that we just read a little bit earlier, our giving needs to be with forethought and with planning. How much thought goes into my contribution? I told you the story earlier of the fellow who just, for 15 years, it was just the same $20. And hey, there might be a situation where that's me and that's how much I've been prospered each week, and that's what I'm going to give. I'm not saying giving $20 is bad. I'm not saying giving $5 is bad. I have a distinct memory of being in high school, and I got my first checkbook, and I'm writing $5 checks every Sunday, putting them in the plate at the local church. I thought that was just big stuff. Right? So I've been on a lot of these different sides, and I get that. But how much thought goes into my contribution? Big if I get that. But if I'm the person who it's just been years and I'm just giving the same amount, might it be appropriate just to look at that number and think, okay, here's what I've been prospered. Am I giving consistently with that with which I've been prospered? To give with forethought, and they were to give with planning. Do we sit down and consider these things? I would hate to think that with all of the forethought and planning and thinking that goes into all the other aspects of our worship, our song leaders who get their songs in ahead of time, our men who lead prayer, who think about what they're going to say before they get up here, hopefully sermons that reflect study that has gone on prior to getting up in the pulpit, Bible class teachers who spend time during the week to prepare their lesson. I would hate to think that out of everything that we do in the local church, that when it comes to our giving, we're just reaching into our wallets and whatever we happen to land on, that's what we're putting in. Unless it's 100, then we're putting that back and maybe a couple of 20s or a 50 or something like that. I'd hate for that to be how we give, that comparatively we would give such little thought to that as we would give so much more thought to other things. Our giving needs to be free from covetousness. We saw that in chapter 9 and verse 5, that we might give a bountiful gift not affected by by covetousness. And then giving bountifully and cheerfully. Does the giving in which I engage, does that reflect the spiritual harvest that I desire? Again, this is where leadership is so crucial, to explain, hey, here is what our money is going towards. Here's what we're funding. Here's what we're having, to use a more biblical term, here's what we're having fellowship in. Here's the work we're sharing in. If we're convicted that that work is good, are we giving in such a way to sustain that? Is giving that something that makes us happy? I remember, I told you the story. I remember I got my first checking account. And I'm out there refereeing soccer. And I'm not making a killing. But bless my parents, one of the things they instilled within me from a young age is, hey, you give because of all the good that God has done for you, you be sure to return something back to Him. And I didn't have a fancy checkbook like my dad, but I had that one that they gave everyone who opened the minimal checking account. You know, that little plastic cover that's going to get torn and ink blotted and everything. And right now, I had $5 in my pocket, but writing the check was just so much cooler, right? And then our kids today are like, what's a check? I was happy to give. And then you get into adulthood, when instead of the credit card companies trying to give you money, now they're saying, hey, give us our money back, right? And suddenly giving becomes a little bit more difficult. But I'll just tell you, full disclosure, I'm still happy when I get to give. Is that because maybe I'm a little bit more aware of what's going on? It might be, I don't know. But I'll tell you, one thing giving tells me is that I have the ability to help. I'm glad I have the ability to help. I want to help. And I don't know of a single person in this congregation who would say otherwise, who would say, I don't want to help. If we have the opportunity to help, are we seizing that opportunity to help? Are we giving bountifully? Are we giving cheerfully? So let's think about this in practical terms as we start to wrap up. Number one, thoughtful, cheerful, bountiful giving requires in part a knowledge of what is happening, what needs are present, and what needs might be on the horizon. To that point, flip back over to 1 Corinthians 16. This is not on our screen, but something I want us to think about. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Why were these Christians to lay by and store, to contribute on the first day of the week, storing up what was given? Do you see the reason given there in chapter 16 and verse 2? So that there be no collections when I come. So when Paul arrived, you wouldn't have to run here and there and everywhere else, gathering up bit by bit, that it's already there, that it's ready to go. Part of the wisdom in God's design of the local church is that it's got this treasury. It's got these funds already set aside, not only for present needs, but apparently also for future needs that may arise, so that when those needs arise, the local church is ready to help in whatever proportion it can help. But part of what is so absolutely crucial in a congregation funding itself well is leadership that is there sharing a vision for the future. I'm thankful we have shepherds who are doing that. So many churches don't have that, which I think contributes to a lot of resentment that you see in people towards religion, where they're told to give money on Sundays and then they have no clue where that money goes. I'm thankful that we have more dedicated leadership here than what other places have, but that kind of leadership is crucial for churches to give and to give well. Then we need to give bountifully with forethought. But to do that, that requires that I assess my own situation and give accordingly. I've got to look at my own life. I'm not over here examining, what is he giving? What is she giving? Are they really giving enough? Am I giving what suits my situation? And as I sat and thought about that and thought about how best to express that, here's what I came up with. So here's insight into Tyler. I sat there and I thought, okay, I'm going to look at my entertainment budget. And does my monthly entertainment budget shame my giving? What are we paying for cable and internet now? 150, 170 if you got them together. Maybe if you're on a first-year deal, you get it lower and then they skyrocket your rate. Who knows why? Who just got the Netflix email? Anybody else, right? Your rates are going up. $17.99 for a subscription now. Anyone got your Hulu package maybe? Or your Amazon Prime membership? Don't talk about that, right? All those cardboard boxes coming to the front door. Anyone try to go to the movie theater lately? Unless you have one of those passes, how much is that costing? You go one time a month and you're just taking two people, that's $30, $40, and that's before you get a drink or some popcorn. And then if you're bringing others with you, that number goes up even more. That right there is almost $250 a month without considering vacations, live events, eating out, anything like that. So I just sat there and I thought about my own entertainment budget, what we spend. I got to thinking, does the money that I spend monthly on entertainment, does that shame my giving? Or how about this? Netflix goes up, Hulu goes up, Disney Plus goes up, Amazon goes up, everything, Spotify goes up, Apple Music goes up, whatever, it all goes up, right? We talk about inflation. But then my giving doesn't change? Again, just a question. And not saying we're ever doing anything intentionally like that. But is what I spend on just entertaining myself, what does that say in comparison to my giving? Wouldn't you agree with me that would be a sad commentary if we were spending more on entertaining ourselves than on doing the work that God has set before us to do? And not only the work that He has set before us to do, but the work that He has equipped us to do. As was mentioned a few weeks back by our elders, we're currently doing a little bit of deficit spending here. That's currently not problematic because of our surplus that's in the bank here. But if that trend continues, our elders have identified that in coming years, that's going to require us to scale back some of the good work that we're doing overseas. And the size of this deficit we're dealing with is not astronomical, at least in congregational terms. It's about $500 a week. And there's a number of ways to solve that. Maybe the fact of the matter is that we're just overspending on particularly the men that we support overseas in preaching the gospel. Maybe we're just overextended there. But if you're like me, right, confession, good for the soul, bad for the reputation. If you're like me, well, you're not like me because you didn't get to see the sermon beforehand, but I got to see the sermon beforehand. And you realize, I could probably do a little bit better. And so I'm going to do a little bit better. And maybe you fall into the same category, I don't know. But what if we had 10 families, pulling a number out of thin air, who were able to give $50 more a week? That deficit goes away, doesn't it? That's a lot. I might not be able to do that. You might not be able to do that. I don't know if anyone's able to do that. But what if we had 50 families who were able to give $10 more a week? What happens to that deficit? It's gone. Or what if we found just 100 people who were able and willing to give $5 more a week? What happens to that deficit? It's gone. And I hope you understand, this isn't designed to shame anyone or to cast aspersions on what anyone's giving. I don't know what anyone is given besides me. But here's the purpose I want this graphic to accomplish. Who knows what my willingness to increase my contribution just a little bit can accomplish? Me increasing my contribution by $5 a week doesn't sound like a whole lot to some people. But what if 100 people did that? What if 150 people did that? What if 200 people did that? What if someone said, you know what, I can do a little bit more than 5. I can do 10. I can do 15. I can do 20. I don't know what your situation is. But do you see how quickly that adds up and how quickly this situation resolves itself? Doug Freeman, Mitch, Kent, Travis, Todd, they could tell you that we continually at this local church get more requests for funding than what we are able to engage with, than what we're able to support. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to take on more of those requests? We may not be able to. And if we're not able to, if we're all giving what we can give, then that's good and well. And we'll just have to adjust, and we'll be fine, and God will be glorified in that. But if maybe we haven't thought about what we're giving, and maybe we look at it and maybe we're able to give a little bit more, God will be glorified in that too, won't He? And we'll be able to accomplish more. And we'll be able to be more helpful and more prepared for the good work that God has set before us. What God expects is the seed that He has given me. He expects me to use it. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 10, He who supplies seed for the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness, he says there. Which tells us what I give plays a role in my being righteous before God. We're not just talking about money and helping and things like that. We're talking about responsibilities that we have as Christians. And that as we give, that opens up the door to more giving. In verse 11, you will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. Not only does it open the door to more giving, but my giving leads other people closer to God through the good work that we're able to accomplish through that. We've got so many who are willing to act. Let's make sure that we don't fall into the trap of the Corinthians, being willing to act, but failing to follow through on that. And as we look at our lives and our hearts, and as we think about what we give today, it doesn't matter what other people think about what we give. What matters is whether or not God is honored by what we give. Do we give in recognition that everything that we have comes from Him, and we return back that with which we've been prospered? As you notice there in 2 Corinthians 9, keep reading in verse 12. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of many saints, but is also overflowing with many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. Your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what this is all about. It's about serving Jesus, honoring Him, rendering obedience to the gospel, giving back our love to the one who loved us and gave Himself for us. And part of that involves how we give. But it doesn't really matter how much we give if we haven't done what we just read. if we haven't yielded our lives in obedience to Jesus Christ. If you look at your life this morning and you're outside of a relationship with Him, could we encourage you to take that first step and begin to walk with Him? If you believe in Jesus, would you turn from your sin? Would you confess Him as your Savior? Would you be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins and raised to walk a new life? And start there. If you're ready to make that decision this morning, we're ready to help you. Maybe as a Christian, you look at your life, you haven't been living as you should, you haven't been obedient to Jesus, you've fallen away from Him, but you want to come back. We want to pray with you and encourage you and help you in whatever way we can. If you need to respond to the gospel this morning, would you let us know by coming while we stand?